January 3rd, 2026. The digital clocks in the Pentagon War Room had barely ticked past midnight when the first encrypted transmission confirmed what only a handful of people on Earth knew was coming. Operation Thunderbolt, a name that would soon echo through diplomatic chambers and intelligence, briefings across 5 continents, had reached its culmination. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Venezuelan capital, American Special Operations Forces were already wheels up, departing from Simón Bolívar International Airport with a cargo that would redraw the geopolitical map of Latin America. The target was not a weapons facility. It was not an airfield or a communications tower. The target was a man, Nicolás Maduro Moros, president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, along with his wife and closest confidants, had been extracted from the very seat of power he had occupied for over a decade. They were now in American custody, bound for a federal courthouse where indictments for narco-terrorism, corruption, and crimes against humanity awaited. This was not an invasion in the traditional sense. No armored columns rolled across borders. No carrier battle groups appeared on the horizon. Instead, what the world witnessed was the perfection of a doctrine that has been gestating in American military academies since the targeted killings of the early 2000s. This was leadership elimination as a political tool, executed with surgical precision and overwhelming technological superiority. The entire operation, from the moment the first cyber payload corrupted Venezuelan air defense networks to the moment Maduro was buckled into a military transport aircraft, lasted less than 4 hours. The timing of this operation is not coincidental. Exactly 6 years prior, on January 3rd, 2020, President Trump authorized a drone strike outside Baghdad International Airport that killed Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general who commanded the Quds Force. The repetition of this date reveals a pattern, a signature of strategic messaging. By executing high-stakes operations at the beginning of the calendar year, the administration establishes dominance of the narrative cycle. It forces adversaries into a reactive posture and signals to domestic audiences that decisive leadership is being exercised. It is psychological warfare wrapped in operational timing. But to truly understand the magnitude of what has just occurred, we must journey backward through the tangled history of Venezuela and its turbulent relationship with the Colossus to the north. This is not merely the story of a dictator's fall. It is the story of how a nation, blessed with unimaginable natural wealth, became a cautionary tale of squandered potential, ideological rigidity, and the crushing weight of geopolitical rivalries. Venezuela occupies a position of extraordinary strategic importance. Sitting at the northernmost edge of South America, it acts as the hinge between the Caribbean basin and the continental landmass. Its coastline stretches for nearly 3,000 kilometers, offering ports and access points that have been coveted by empires for centuries. The country spans over 900,000 square kilometers, making it roughly equivalent in size to the combined territories of France and Germany. Within its borders live more than 31 million people, a population that has been battered by economic collapse but remains young, educated, and potentially productive. The land itself is a geological treasure chest. Beneath the Orinoco River basin lie the largest proven petroleum reserves on the planet, exceeding even those of Saudi Arabia. These are not the light, sweet crude that flows easily from Middle Eastern wells, but heavy, viscous deposits that require advanced refining techniques. Yet their sheer volume makes them a prize beyond measure. In addition to oil, Venezuela possesses vast deposits of natural gas, gold, iron ore, and bauxite. It is a country that, under rational management, should be among the wealthiest nations in the hemisphere. The irony is suffocating. This nation of staggering resource, wealth has become synonymous with economic catastrophe. To understand this paradox, we must return to the moment when Venezuela's modern trajectory was set. The rise of Hugo Chavez. The Venezuela that existed before Chavez was a flawed democracy, plagued by corruption and inequality, but it was also a functioning petrostate that maintained diplomatic ties with Washington and participated in the global oil market as a reliable supplier. The political system was dominated by 2 main parties that alternated power, and while they enriched themselves and their allies, they also maintained a basic social contract with the population. However, the collapse of oil prices in the 1980s exposed the fragility of this arrangement. The government, which had grown accustomed to lavish spending during the boom years, was forced to implement austerity measures imposed by the International Monetary Fund. Subsidies were slashed, fuel prices rose, and the population erupted in fury. The Caracazo riots of 1989 were a watershed moment. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, died as the military opened fire on protesters in the streets of the capital. The social contract between the state and its citizens was shattered. Into this vacuum stepped a young army officer who had watched the violence with disgust and concluded that the entire system needed to be overthrown. Hugo Chavez Frias was born in the rural llanos of Barinas, the son of schoolteachers. He joined the military academy not out of a desire for power, but because it offered an escape from poverty. As a junior officer, he was exposed to leftist ideology, reading Simón Bolívar, Karl Marx, and the revolutionary texts of the Cuban and Nicaraguan movements. He formed a clandestine cell within the military dedicated to overthrowing the government and establishing a revolutionary regime. On February 4th, 1992, Chávez led a coup attempt that failed spectacularly. But in his brief televised address, in which he accepted responsibility and uttered the phrase, "For now," he became a folk hero overnight. He was imprisoned, but his message had resonated with millions of Venezuelans who felt abandoned by the political elite. Released after 2 years, Chávez renounced armed struggle and turned to electoral politics. He traveled the country, speaking in plazas and barrios, promising to redistribute the oil wealth to the poor, to rewrite the corrupt constitution, and to challenge the dominance of the United States in the region. In 1998, he won the presidency in a landslide, and the Bolivarian Revolution was born. Chávez's first term coincided with a dramatic rise in global oil prices. The revenues that poured into Caracas allowed him to fund expansive social programs known as missions. These programs provided healthcare, education, and unsubsidized food to millions of people who had been ignored by previous governments. For the first time in their lives, many Venezuelans felt that the state cared about them. Chávez's approval rating soared, and he used this popularity to consolidate power. He rewrote the Constitution, extending presidential terms and eliminating checks on executive authority. He packed the Supreme Court with loyalists and used state resources to dominate the media landscape. But it was his foreign policy that transformed Venezuela from a regional player into a global irritant for Washington. Chávez viewed the United States not as a partner, but as an imperial aggressor bent on crushing any government that refused to submit to its economic model. He forged a deep alliance with Cuba, sending subsidized oil to Havana in exchange for intelligence, support, and thousands of Cuban doctors and advisors who helped run his social programs. He traveled to Saddam Hussein's Baghdad, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's Tehran, and Vladimir Putin's Moscow, building an axis of anti-American regimes. He purchased billions of dollars in Russian weapons, displacing American military suppliers. He invited Chinese state-owned enterprises to invest in Venezuelan oil, giving Beijing a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Under Chávez, Venezuela became a haven for groups that the United States classified as terrorists or narco-traffickers. Colombian guerrilla organizations, like the FARC and ELN, used Venezuelan territory as a safe haven. Hezbollah operatives established financial networks in the country's free trade zones. The line between the state and organized crime began to blur. Despite this hostility, the United States continued to import Venezuelan oil because American refineries on the Gulf Coast were specifically designed to process Venezuelan heavy crude. The economic relationship, though strained, remained intact, but the political relationship was dead. When Chávez died of cancer in 2013, he left behind a country that was deeply polarized and economically vulnerable. Nicolás Maduro, Chávez's chosen successor, was a former bus driver and union organizer who had risen through the ranks of the party. He lacked Chávez's charisma, his strategic vision, and his luck. Within months of taking power, the global oil market collapsed. The price of crude plummeted from over $100 per barrel to below $30. The Venezuelan economy, which had become entirely dependent on oil revenue, went into freefall. What followed was an economic implosion of almost unimaginable scale. The GDP contracted by more than 75%. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency, with the exchange rate spiraling into the millions, and then billions of bolívares to the dollar. Supermarkets emptied. Hospitals ran out of medicine. The electricity grid began to fail. Malnutrition became widespread. Millions of Venezuelans, unable to survive in their own country, fled across the borders into Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and beyond. It became the largest refugee crisis in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere. As the economy collapsed, the regime turned to crime to survive. The United States government accused Maduro and his inner circle of transforming Venezuela into a narco-state. According to U.S. indictments, high-ranking officials and military generals formed what became known as the Cartel of the Suns, facilitating the movement of hundreds of tons of cocaine from Colombian producers through Venezuelan territory to international markets. The regime also exploited illegal gold mining operations in the Amazon, devastating indigenous lands and ecosystems to extract gold that was sold on black markets to generate cash. Politically, Maduro responded to the crisis by tightening his grip. When the opposition won a landslide victory in the 2015 legislative elections, he used the judiciary to strip the National Assembly of its powers. When protests erupted in 2017, his security forces responded with lethal force, killing hundreds. When the opposition leader, Juan Guaidó, declared himself interim president in 2019 and was recognized by over 50 countries, including the United States, Maduro refused to step down. He survived because the military remained loyal, because Russia and China provided financial support, and because the opposition was unable to deliver a decisive blow. The Trump administration's first term saw the implementation of a maximum pressure campaign. Sanctions targeted the oil sector, freezing assets and cutting off access to international finance. The goal was to starve the regime of revenue and force a collapse. But Maduro adapted. He relied on clandestine oil sales, often to China and Russia at discounted prices. He used cryptocurrency to evade financial restrictions. And he leaned on Cuban intelligence to maintain control over the security apparatus. The Biden administration attempted a different approach, offering limited sanctions relief in exchange for negotiations and commitments to hold free elections. These talks produced little. Maduro used the breathing room to consolidate power further, disqualifying opposition candidates and arresting political activists. By the time Trump returned to the White House in 2025, the assessment in Washington was clear. Diplomacy had failed, sanctions had weakened but not removed the regime, and the status quo was unacceptable. The decision to authorize a decapitation strike was not taken lightly. The legal justification rested on the federal indictments against Maduro for narcoterrorism and crimes against humanity. The operational justification rested on the belief that the Venezuelan military, stripped of its leader, would fracture and seek an accommodation with the opposition, rather than wage a suicidal war against the United States. The strategic justification rested on the Monroe Doctrine, the assertion that the Western Hemisphere is the natural sphere of influence of the United States, and that hostile foreign powers, Russia, China, Iran, cannot be allowed to establish permanent footholds in the region. In the weeks preceding the operation, U.S. intelligence assets inside Venezuela provided real-time information on Maduro's movements. Cyber warfare units mapped the Venezuelan air defense network, identifying vulnerabilities and backdoors. Special operations planners rehearsed the raid and mock-ups of the presidential palace. Diplomatic backchannels were open to key military commanders, offering them a way out if they cooperated. And on the morning of January 3rd, the plan was executed. The immediate aftermath of the strike is where the true test begins. The removal of Maduro is the easy part. Managing the power vacuum is exponentially more difficult. As dawn breaks over Caracas on this historic day, the city is paralyzed by uncertainty. State television broadcasts martial music and empty government statements. The streets are quiet, but it is the quiet of shock, not peace. The most critical actor in the coming hours is the Venezuelan military. The armed forces are not a unified institution. They are a collection of fiefdoms, each controlled by a general who has grown rich through corruption. These men are not ideologues. They are businessmen in uniform who control lucrative contracts in the oil sector, food distribution, and mining. With Maduro gone, they face a stark choice: fight a war they cannot win, or negotiate a transition that might allow them to keep their wealth and avoid prosecution. Within hours of the strike, the Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, appeared on television surrounded by the military high command. His statement was carefully calibrated. He did not call for resistance. He did not invoke Chavez's legacy or vow to fight to the death. Instead, he called for calm, declared a state of emergency, and urged the armed forces to maintain order and respect the sovereignty of the nation. This ambiguity is deliberate. It leaves the door open for negotiation. Behind the scenes, secure communications have almost certainly been established between Washington and key figures in the Venezuelan officer corps. The United States is offering a deal: facilitate a transition to civilian rule, cooperate with the disarmament of paramilitary groups, and you will be allowed to retire with your assets intact. Refuse, and you will be hunted like Maduro. But the military is not the only armed force in Venezuela. The colectivos, the pro-government, paramilitary gangs that control large swaths of Caracas' slums are a wild card. These groups are ideologically committed and have nothing to lose. They see the removal of Maduro as a foreign invasion and may launch a campaign of urban resistance. If they do, the United States will face a dilemma: commit ground forces to stabilize the capital or allow the situation to spiral into anarchy. Enter Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader who has become the symbol of resistance to the regime. Machado is a fierce critic of Chavismo and a vocal advocate for free market reforms and reintegration with the West. Despite being banned from holding office by the regime's courts, she commanded the loyalty of millions of Venezuelans who saw her as the legitimate voice of the opposition. Her organization has maintained an underground network throughout the years of repression, and she has been preparing for this moment. Machado's vision for Venezuela is clear: immediate release of political prisoners, stabilization of the currency, reopening of the economy to foreign investment, and the privatization of the state oil company. She represents a complete repudiation of the Bolivarian project. But for her to assume power, she needs the military to step aside. The United States envisions a transitional council that includes opposition figures, technocrats, and perhaps even reformed elements of the military. This council would govern temporarily, oversee the restoration of democratic institutions, and prepare for free elections. This is the optimistic scenario, but history offers little reason for optimism. When Saddam Hussein was removed in 2003, Iraq descended into sectarian war. When Muammar Gaddafi fell in 2011, Libya fragmented into warlord-controlled territories. Venezuela has its own unique vulnerabilities. Porous borders with Colombia where armed groups operate freely, a population awash in weapons, and deep societal divisions that cannot be healed overnight. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity. Russia and China have invested billions in Venezuela. Russia views the country as a strategic outpost in America's backyard, a way to project influence and challenge U.S. hegemony. China views it as a source of oil and a partner in its Belt and Road Initiative. Neither power will be pleased to see their investment wiped out by American military action. While they are unlikely to intervene militarily to rescue a fallen dictator, they have other tools. They can provide covert support to resistance groups, launch cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure, or use their veto power in the United Nations to delegitimize any transitional government. Then there is the humanitarian question. Venezuela's economy is in ruins. The oil infrastructure is so degraded that it will take years and tens of billions of dollars to restore production. The health system has collapsed. Poverty is endemic. If the transition is mismanaged, the suffering will intensify, and a new wave of refugees will flood across borders, destabilizing Colombia, Brazil, and the entire region. This will create a political crisis for the Trump administration, which has staked its credibility on securing the U.S. southern border. The economic reconstruction of Venezuela represents both a challenge and an opportunity. If stability can be restored, international oil companies will rush to return. ExxonMobil, Chevron, and European energy giants have the capital and expertise to revive the oil sector. A functioning Venezuelan oil industry would increase global supply, lower prices, and further isolate petrostates like Russia and Iran. It would also generate revenue that could fund the rebuilding of the country's infrastructure and social services. But getting from here to there requires threading a needle. The United States must stabilize the security situation without becoming bogged down in a counterinsurgency. It must support the opposition without being seen as imposing a puppet government. It must balance the demands of the Venezuelan people for justice with the pragmatic need to co-opt elements of the old regime to prevent total chaos. And it must manage the reactions of regional powers, many of whom will view the operation as a violation of sovereignty and a dangerous precedent. Leftist governments in Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico are likely to condemn the operation as imperialist aggression. Colombian President Gustavo Petro, who has pursued a policy of engagement with Maduro, will face intense pressure from his base to denounce the United States. Brazilian President Lula, a longtime critic of American interventionism, may call for a regional summit to address the crisis. These reactions will complicate U.S. diplomacy and could fracture the hemispheric consensus that Washington needs to legitimize the transition. As the sun sets on January 3rd, 2026, the world is watching Venezuela with a mixture of fascination and dread. The decapitation strike has succeeded tactically, but the strategic gamble has only just begun. The Venezuelan people, after 25 years of revolution and 13 years of economic collapse, are exhausted and divided. Some celebrate the removal of Maduro as the end of a nightmare. Others mourn it as the beginning of foreign occupation. Reconciling these two visions of Venezuela will require leadership, resources, and time, commodities that are in short supply. The United States has rolled the dice. It has bet that a swift, decisive action can break a deadlock that years of sanctions and diplomacy could not. It is a wager that reflects a belief in the utility of military power to achieve political ends. But as the helicopters that carried Maduro out of Caracas return to their bases, and as the initial adrenaline fades, the hard work of state building begins. This is the phase where victories are either solidified or squandered. History will judge this operation not by the success of the raid, but by what comes after. If Venezuela emerges from this crisis as a stable, democratic, and prosperous nation, it will be hailed as a strategic masterstroke. If it descends into chaos, becoming a failed state that exports violence and refugees, it will be remembered as a catastrophic miscalculation. The outcome is not yet written. The script is being drafted in real time by actors in Caracas, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and a dozen other capitals. What is certain is that the rules of the game have changed. The United States has demonstrated that it is willing to bypass diplomatic norms and sovereign borders to achieve its security objectives. It has shown that distance is not a shield, and that even fortified capitals are within reach. This sends a message to every regime that believes it can challenge American interests with impunity. The long arm of U.S. military power has reached into the heart of South America and extracted an adversary. The world must now recalibrate its understanding of what Washington is willing to do to protect its perceived interests. For Venezuela, the journey from this moment of rupture to a stable future will be long and fraught. The institutions of the state have been hollowed out by corruption. The economy has been destroyed by mismanagement. The society has been fractured by polarization. Rebuilding will require not just money and expertise, but reconciliation and justice. It will require addressing the grievances that brought Chavez to power in the first place. The inequality, the poverty, the sense of abandonment felt by millions. If the new Venezuela simply replicates the old system that failed in the 1980s, the cycle of revolution and collapse will repeat. As we close this analysis, we are left with more questions than answers. Will the Venezuelan military fragment or remain cohesive? Will Maria Corina Machado be able to unite the opposition and govern effectively? Will the colectivos lay down their arms or wage an insurgency? Will Russia and China accept the loss of their Venezuelan ally or work to destabilize the transition? And will the United States have the patience and resources to see this project through, or will it declare victory prematurely and withdraw, leaving a power vacuum in its wake? The operation that unfolded in the early hours of January 3rd, 2026 is not the end of a story. It is the end of a chapter. The next chapter is being written right now in the streets of Caracas, in the barracks of the military, in the offices of the opposition, and in the situation rooms of global capitals. The Venezuelan people, battered by decades of misrule and broken promises, are waiting to see if they have been liberated, or if they have simply traded one form of chaos for another. The world holds its breath. The outcome of this gambit will reverberate across Latin America and beyond, shaping the contours of geopolitics for years to come. This is a moment of profound transformation, and like all such moments, it carries within it the seeds of both hope and disaster. The choice of which seed will grow depends on the decisions made in the days and weeks ahead. History is unfolding in real time, and we are all witnesses to it.